Good morning. I am certainly not trying to take over from Dr. Anders. However, ever so often, I do think it's important to take a look at literature and the underlying principles that are presented in literature. And ever so often, I think literature has a bit of philosophy involved with it, and it's important to note that and talk about it. Perhaps one can argue that all my discussions of fate and free will have been philosophical. I think they're too random to qualify as that. However, one of the things that the book talks about quite frequently is the development of good character. And one of the people who talked about good character first, unsurprisingly, was the philosopher Aristotle. And he talked about the idea of creating virtue. He also had a list of virtues. But in his idea of creating virtue, I think there were three or four important things, and I have three of them listed on screen. One, virtue needs to be a habit. You don't become virtuous or develop virtue by doing things only once. Second, it should not be coerced. You cannot have somebody force virtue upon you. It has to be a choice that you as an individual make. And third, he had a really loose definition of virtue. Virtue is what a good person would do in a similar situation. It was not a list of rules. For virtue and the new virtue ethicists who have sprung up here in the latter half of, or last decade of the 20th century and the early part of the 21st century, they are very, very clear about the fact that this is not a list of rules. This is not a calculus of weigh the good versus the bad. This is a theory that focuses on the actor, not the consequences, or not the rules that prompted the action. Camp Green Lake, I don't think, fits Aristotle's definition. First of all, there's plenty of indication that all of this is about force, that all of this is about coercion, and it doesn't take into account the boys' desire to build themselves into virtuous people. The results, which are on the right hand of the screen, I think illustrate that they are a failure. The people are broken. Okay? Stanley's heart had toughened. He had not become a better person. And by the way, if I can just point out, please make sure you proofread your work better than I proofread this screen. Okay? There's also, I think, the idea that the narrator is being a bit didactic and a bit ironic. Towards the end of the book, there's the statement the reader probably cares more about the change in Stanley's character and self confidence, but those changes are subtle and hard to measure. There is no simple answer. Pretty sure the reader wants to get to the end of the book, especially the ideal reader, the sixth grade reader, wants to get to the end of the book before they care about Stanley's character. However, this is a way to go back and talk about the fact that this is a book that's designed to teach a little bit as well as it's designed to entertain. And the narrator does that in a way that perhaps is not so subtle. The other thing I want to talk about today is the literary genre of magical realism. Again, if you're going to teach elementary school, I don't think you have to go into the classroom and talk about magical realism. I do think, however, that this book is a prime example of magical realism, and it's a genre that if you are teaching or you are reading and you enjoy the historical time shifts and all of the other things that have occurred in this novel, it's a genre or subgenre that you might want to be looking for. It's also a subgenre if you like Spanish and Latin America, because that's where it originated. There are several definitions. The idea of being surreal, the idea of having shock, the idea of mingling and juxtaposing the realistic and the fantastic. It's often going to be convoluted. Second definition, again, combining reality and fantasy, transforming the real into something awesome and unreal. Please remember here, awesome is not as in, wow, that's the greatest thing I've ever seen. That was awesome. It is in filling people with awe and wonder. It is the idea that people are overwhelmed by the experience. There is a sense of awe as if they have just seen God and lived. And there's a bunch of surprises, oftentimes because time and space are distorted. And I even tried to create a visual. The magical realm will have God or the gods. It will talk about the spiritual. It will talk about miracles. It will talk about magic. And those things will be real. The non magical realm, the realistic realm, the realm of Aristotle and Madonna, who were living in a material world, or string theory and the Big Bang theory, dark matter, instead of looking to a miracle to explain something or looking to God to explain something, there will be a string theory to explain it. Dark matter will explain it. These worlds don't interact very often. The Venn diagram is very, very small. And in fact, I probably made it far too big. It's just that I wanted to point out that there might be an intersection. And magical realism, in some ways, operates where those two worlds intersect. And that intersection is very, very small. Let's talk about the time shifts on pages 28 through 40. The book just jumps back and forth between Stanley digging his first hole and Ilya making the deal. Stanley keeps digging, Ilya carries the pig up the mountain. Stanley's blisters pop and he keeps digging, and Myra asks the suitors to pick a number. Stanley uses the hole as a latrine, Ilya becomes a deckhand. And it just jumps back and forth as if they're occurring at the same time. One of my favorite short stories is The Night Face Up. And in The Night Face Up, we have a prime example of magical realism. It begins in a modern city with a guy riding a motorcycle. He has an accident. He is taken to the hospital. All of a sudden, we switch back to the time of the Aztecs, and there's a guy running away from people who are trying to kill him. And we switch back to the hospital, and we find the doctor getting ready to operate. We switch back to the Aztecs. The guy is captured. He is taken to the priest. The doctor starts preparing the scalpel and the other tools. The priest starts preparing his tools. And by the time we get to the end, both the operation and the human sacrifice are happening at the same time. As we are looking at Stanley digging his hole and Ilya climbing the mountain, they're happening at the same time. And the time shift, even if it's in the back of our heads, we're thinking that it is that it is occurring at two different times. The time shifts make it think that it's almost simultaneous. Perhaps I'm stressing this one a little bit too hard, but it does strike me that with the curse and with this other stuff, the time shifts would, in a normal novel, would be broken up much more clearly, and there would be time. The tenses would be indicated much more clearly than they are here. Second time shift, the pages where they talk about Kate Barlow going from the school teacher to the kissing bandit, and finally to the point where she dies laughing, and Stanley uh, digging and whatever all else. I think this is part of the escape. Those sorts of things. Again, there's not a lot of indicators that say one happened 100 years ago and one happened now. There are some. For example, the idea that the last rain fell 100 years ago. But a lot of these actions are happening at the same time. Let's run through a few other things. The definition talked about things like being horrific or inexplicable. I do think the idea of Sam being killed for no other reason than falling in love with Kate. I think the idea that they killed the mule for no other reason than Sam owned it. The idea that Kate is taken against her will. All of these, I think, are horrific. It's also inexplicable that we have this place that has now been a desert for 110 years. It has to be one of the driest places on Earth. I recently heard some trivia that Antarctica, has the driest spot on Earth. But nonetheless, 110 years without rain, that's pretty inexplicable. And the idea that it is linked to this one time, this one event, is also inexplicable. And the fact that Stanley shows up at this one spot where his great grandfather or great great grandfather also would have been, and the fact that there's the connection between Stanley and his great grandfather and the Kate Barlow, and there's a connection between Kate Barlow and the warden. All of those things also, I think, are inexplicable. Again, the horrific, um, the idea of the murder, the idea of the red lipstick and the kiss, but also it's inexplicable that 3 days after Sam's death, 3 days had passed since the warden had scratched Mr. Sir. Those time frames are exactly the same. Bad stuff was happening. One case perhaps justly, the other case unjustly. It doesn't matter too much. Um, the fact is, again, it's horrific, a murder. It's inexplicable that the time, 3 days after one, 3 days after the other. And then there are all of these weird coincidences that the sunken boat becomes a shade. Obviously, the time shift has gone away. That the sploosh are jars of Kate Barlow's spiced peaches. That the great grandfather is saved by the thumb of God. That Stanley and Zero are saved by the thumb of God. And that the thumb of God is home to Sam's miracle onions that prevent the lizards from biting. There's a lot of coincidences here. There's a lot of things that just are magical. And to go back to the chart, it doesn't, there's not an awful lot of cross reference, but there seems to be some. And I think, again, this leads it into the realm of magical realism. It's probably not the greatest example, but once again, if we look at something like The Life of Pi, there was the real world, and then there was the world on the lifeboat, and the idea of being on the lifeboat and not having the tiger eat the boy strikes as something magical. And then in The Life of Pi in the book, the scene on the island and the weirdness with the tooth and all that other sort of stuff, I think are important elements of the magical element, and even the metaphoric raining animals and things like that. All of that, I think, also ties in here to Holes. Then there's some inexplicable stuff. Certainly, it can't be explained that the invention of the foot odor cure happens at the very time Stanley is carrying Zero up the mountain. And the fact that the descendants of Ilya Yelnats and Madame Zeroni met at this camp with all of the other connections is certainly, once again, something that's inexplicable. And I realize that fiction in general, especially fiction for young kids, can contain a lot of inexplicable elements. But these, once again, are bordering on a spot where realism and magic are coming in very, very close contact. We are setting most of this in a real world situation, a boys' camp designed to pound into him the idea of virtue, to go back to the philosophy without a license, and a hot and terrible place with this magical place with an onion that keeps lizards from biting you, with peaches that last 150 years in a jar or 120 years, whatever it is. Those sorts of things, I think, are inexplicable and bring the realm of magic into the realm of real. Remember, I talked about that first introduction. Magical realism begins in the real world, and bits of magic seep in. And I think in Holes, we begin in a real world, and little bits of magic seep in, even a curse that may or may not be real, but is broken at a weird time. Okay, when we come back in class, there'll be a wrap up. Before the wrap up, we're probably going to do a writing thing where I just want to give people some tips about a tool to do some sentence revision and sentence structuring better. Also, before the wrap up, we'll be talking about what I believe is a connection to Greek mythology, and that ties in, I think, importantly enough, or coincidentally enough, to the idea of the curse being broken and what Stanley had to do to break the curse. So I hope you all have a good day. Those of you who are watching this, I'll see you in class next time, and we'll begin the wrap up from there. Enjoy.